Discover how to heal anger, shame, and low self-esteem in today's episode with Lincoln Stoller. And he is the psychotherapist at Mind Strength Balance. And he'll be talking about how entrepreneurs can heal anger, shame, and low self-esteem. So please, Lincoln, tell us, how can entrepreneurs do that? Heal Podcast with Lily Patrascu shares longevity and anti-aging techniques to stay young forever, increase energy, overcome addiction, and live your longest, best life ever. Shared by world's most innovative, alternative, and traditional health thought leaders, healers, and doctors. Discover quantum healing strategies to heal your mind, body, and soul.
Hi, well, thanks for having me. Let's see. I don't know if it's everyone's problem. And I'm not sure it should be their problem, but as a therapist, of course, I get people who come to me with problems. And entrepreneurs, I think those are more personal problems than organizational. You know what I mean? It's like, if you have anger, shame, and self-esteem problems, I'm not sure they would manifest in your organization, because most people would probably try to avoid that. And so when I get people coming to me with, well, they usually don't come to me with those problems. They come with problems that are more material, more demonstrable, more manifest. And, I kind of have to work my way back to those problems. So there are probably few people who would put right out front that those are their problems. And I find it's hard to get a grip on those problems unless they have a context. So, if you just consider, well, there are three different things. Let's consider anger. It's probably more common in a frustrating and dynamic environment. You would have to note it as something that was destructive, because it's not entirely destructive. Anger can be useful. It can be a boundary, and it can be used respectfully. It may sound funny, but it can be. As long as it's not violent or destructive. I mean, you can be angry about things like politics or inefficiency or bad behavior, and it can orient and organize a response to those things. And it only becomes a problem when you can't control it, or you get triggered by it, or you can't see it coming. And I think in general, entrepreneurs have to be organized people, so that you could say that if anger is a problem, it's usually because it's not being well organized, sort of like time management. You could consider it like anger management. And we have a lot of stories of executives who don't seem to manage their anger very well. I'm thinking of like Steve Jobs was famous for being a maniac, and others. And some people come to me, they're not sure if they're angry, they're just upset or disturbed by things. And the question is, are these important? Should they respond? How should they respond? And are they responsible? So I would say that, just looking at the anger issue, I think it's the easiest. A person has to decide if you're going to take it on, if anger is an issue. Have other people said it was? Are you getting anxious or disturbed by it, kept awake or otherwise made ineffective? And it's an interesting question, because some people manage by brute force and aggression, and other people are, I guess, more pliant and you could say more managerial. So I would say that addresses the one of them.
Thank you. So let's take a practical example, okay? So in my case, I suffer from anger, shame, and low self-esteem, okay? So why and how does that manifest, okay? Is, for example, let's say we do this podcast, and then imagine that your name gets spelled out as Lincoln Stoller instead of Stoller, right? For you, it's a big deal. For them, it's not so much, okay? So it's like what annoys me, for example, is when things are not perfect. And the reason why it annoys me is because I was brought up to be perfect, at least to strive to be perfect. And I suffer from shame because when I was really young, my grandma used to beat me, and one time she even put me in front of the house naked. And I was there for like, I don't know, 8 hours. And how that manifests is every time I organize a large event of 250 people, I self-sabotage. And how that manifests is I self-sabotage through illness. Okay. And low self-esteem. I guess I'm growing on that, but I find that how that manifests is that I doubt myself a lot. Although I'm one of the best in the industry, and I still doubt myself. So let's take these kind of very practical examples and tell us how an entrepreneur like me would go about healing their anger, let's say anger at employees, general shame, and low self-esteem. Now, in terms of the anger against employees, how can that anger be channeled towards a productive way? Now, you said you don't know if that could really affect them. It does, and I'll tell you how, okay? When I am in flow, I tend to be incredibly joyful, and then I become incredibly magnetic, and I get thousands of followers and thousands of likes on social media, and then I'm more attractive for business opportunities and for people and on social media, and then it helps me from a business perspective. And the opposite is true. When I have this negative energy, let's say if I'm upset with my team, maybe doing, misspelling your name and, posting with the incorrect job title, or I don't know, some other stuff that, they tend to do really well, okay, in general. But when they mess up, like it irritates me so much. And sometimes what irritates me is especially if I find they don't have common sense, and they are getting better. Okay, so that's how I'm, not necessarily managing my anger, but I can't say that I have found a solution for managing my anger. So there's definitely a massive impact from a business perspective in terms of losing clients, losing potential opportunities for all of these potential issues. And I'm sure that, like me, millions of entrepreneurs suffer from something similar to this, where they are definitely getting impacted by the three.
So I would say that I still see them as weakly connected. That anger is one thing, but I can see there's some connection. And shame and self-esteem are closely connected. At least they could be. Maybe in some cases they're not. But so I would take them as separate. So like you can control your anger. Anger is mostly something to be controlled. It's an energy. It's outward flowing. It's accusative. Shame and self-esteem are inward flowing, and they're violent in a very different way. They're not loud. In fact, they're like pervasively silent, so sort of like an illness rather than a manic episode. And I would, okay. So in your case, perhaps they are related, so that, the experience of error or frustration or what you consider ineffectual behavior or failure to operate correctly triggers your shame. It's like because it reflects on you, perhaps. I don't know.
Yes.
Then you could have both anger and shame operating and sort of low self-esteem in the background operating. And you could say that in that case, getting a hold on one is sort of like three horses pulling the wagon. You can't just settle one of them. You have to settle all of them. And in most cases with psychotherapy, it's a question of becoming aware of what's going on and then letting the energies arrange themselves. So you can't deny your anger. If something's made you angry, it has. The question is, what are you to do with it? And if there's this low self-esteem shame thing going on, you can't deny it. You can repress it. You can ignore it. You can pretend it's not there, but it usually squeaks out and affects your mood and behavior, and it can usually be seen on your face through the insight of more insightful people or sensitive people. So you would want to be aware of all the horses that are pulling your wagon. Not to say that these are the only forces pulling your wagon, but they're the ones that may be pulling you off course. So you would like to have the time and energy to both reflect on your weaknesses And although it's rarely possible, it would be nice if you could discuss them. Well, if you're in a managerial position or you're on the spot or you're trying to produce or provide something, it's obviously inappropriate to like segue into your childhood trauma. But it is an environment you can build if you're attentive. So I would say, this is kind of the answer you give to anybody, not just an entrepreneur. If you want to address your issues, build an environment that allows you to do so. So maybe the boardroom is not suitable. Well, that's your decision. That's your boardroom, your board members, or your, co-managers and employees. You could say the same with your family. Are you able to discuss these with your family where it would be more appropriate? And the answer is usually, for most people, not very well. Or with your partner, or you're with your children, or your parents. Again, the answer is often not very well. But that's because you didn't give it priority. So it's easier, and people come to therapy pretty much expecting to have to deal with other people in their environment, their partner, their children, their parents. They may not know how to do it. They may not do it well. It partly is my job to give them ways to do it, to back off or to get underneath or be more empathetic. And I'd say the big problem in business has been there's a lack of that opportunity. And I don't know how to address that except at the root. Like, get involved with partners who you trust. So in my experience, this was great. When I was a young kid, I started mountaineering. And that's great because you have to trust the people you're with. It's sort of like a business enterprise, but it's got to have its shit together because there are real physical dangers and dependencies and communication. And when I got involved with being a consultant in the computer industry, I could see things were not at that level. They were not at that level of trust and integrity. So, the board would be sniping at each other, or the IT person would have to fight for their point of view because the CEO didn't feel IT issues were important. And in one case, my best client turned out to be a embezzler and went to prison because he was skimming millions of dollars from his company. And that was never evident to me, of course, as a consultant from the outside. Of course, it wasn't evident to anybody until he was caught. And that was after I stopped working with him, so I'm not really sure how it all came down. But I notice, so here are three different environments. A mountaineering environment, which is any extreme sports environment, where you're depending on people either to work with you or not to run into you. And then there's a family environment, and then there's a business environment. And you might say, how can entrepreneurs cope with these things? And I have to say, it's either in your life or you're not going to do it. So you start at the basics ingredient, like get your family shit together as much as you can, or deal with your issues. So the people who come to me, some of them are entrepreneurs or otherwise, high business people. They have business problems, but mostly they come to me with personal problems because they're usually successful as business people and they don't need my advice. But they come to me with the strange things or the things they're not so certain about in making decisions. Legacy things, parents, siblings. And some of the, like I have a client who says his wife's friends disrespect him because they think he's a rich white guy, and rich white guys have nothing to say, and so he has nothing to say. And he wonders, why does she have friends that disrespect him? And it's a good question. It's more of a question for her than for him, perhaps. But he has to live with it because he encounters these people. And so he comes to me with that question. He doesn't have to worry about them in work because they don't work for him. But he does have a kind of short tolerance for, as you might appreciate, people who are screwing up or who aren't well trained. And he kind of resents the fact that he has to retrain people and then they get skilled and then they leave. And then they have to start over again. And that makes him irritated with people and somewhat with his job. So, he comes to me with that question. He doesn't have anyone to talk about it at work with. And so, okay, I do take up the slack there. But it would be better if he, well, obviously, had people within his environment so that the problems didn't come up. So I guess that's my answer to your question, and I'm still being general. And so I'd like to take a moment and address the other issue of low self-esteem and shame. You presented the shame as connected to a traumatic experience, and you presented low self-esteem as wanting to be perfect, and I presume liked, appreciated, and successful. And probably this underlying feeling that you're never doing enough, or you're not fully recognized, or you're not fully representing yourself honestly. And you have to recognize that on top of all these issues is your perception. How do you perceive this stuff? Is your perception clear? Is it biased? Well, it is biased. It's always biased. Our perceptions are our own. And some of those biases are triggered, because somebody said something. And some of them are legacy because you've been carrying them a long time and you've developed an environment in which something's expected of you, which maybe is more than you can ever fully deliver, as in perfection. How do you deal with this stuff? If it's not in your business circuit, then you're going to have to either bring it out of people or, deal with it through a therapist or somebody who's a counselor. Or, unfortunately, what happens with most people is it goes unaddressed to the point where it becomes dominantly a problem, and you become depressed, you become ill, you become intolerable or unmanageable. And then, of course, you have to deal with it, which is kind of too late, because that's like dealing with an emergency, a chronic thing as if it's acute. Well, it becomes acute, but its issue is chronic, long-term, and deeper. So I would say the way entrepreneurs deal with deeper issues is by getting involved with them before they become acute, which means you have to give them some time. And, maybe that means you have to go for walks, or you have to talk to people on odd topics, or do things that, everybody likes to do things that are fun, but do things that are challenging and maybe not so primarily recreational, like talking to people, like engaging with your frustrations, like not getting drunk and not going to, lighthearted, insignificant things. And so, you might say, well, part of your job is to be social and be connected and to present an appearance that's positive and so forth. And I would say, well, okay, but recognize that that's not all of you, and that you may be ignoring an important part of you by playing the role of the perfect person. So often what I'll do with people is I'll contradict them. I'll say, you're not perfect, or, I see you as flawed. And how do you feel about that? And does that bother you? So you say, would I be bothered by you misspelling my name? No, I don't care. The only consequences is some search engines may get confused. But, I couldn't care less, personally, because that's just, I have holes in my socks, but I wear them anyway because they're my favorite socks, right? So who cares? A few holes. And I have a podcast with you, and so you misspell my name, but so what? It's more important that I'm out there speaking to people. A few mistakes are not important. It's different when our rocket blows up, but those things can often be looked at from a humorous point of view. If you're so lucky as to be able to put humor into your failures. You have to remember, well, you don't have to remember, but you should remember, that a good entrepreneur follows the maxim of failing often and failing fast, so that you learn your lessons quickly and you revise your approach accordingly. But you can't expect, the only way you do everything perfect is by doing the same thing over and over again. It reminds me that when I was playing classical guitar, that was the idea. Learn to perfect your performance. And it got very uncreative. A great musician actually is creative in the context of their perfect performance. But most of us are creative and we make mistakes. And that's really okay. So you have to be okay with making mistakes. So this speaks to your issue of self-esteem and shame. Are you, Lily, okay with making mistakes and being humiliated by them? Then your answer is probably no, you're not okay. Well, I would then respond, well, you have to be okay. Otherwise, you're never going to be able to go outside your box into uncharted territory, which would otherwise be frightening and fraught with risks. Well, places that are fraught with risks are often full of opportunities. I mean, almost by definition, that's where you find opportunities. So if you want to grow, which is also an opportunity, you have to get outside your box, which means in some sense, indirectly, you have to expose yourself and you have to be okay with failing. Well, you make it so by presenting yourself authentically rather than as a product of perfection or so forth. I mean, it's very different. As people, we are not the box you buy at the store, where any little flaw will cause you to go back and return it. That can't be the way you deal with people in dynamic situations. The evolution doesn't work through steps of perfection. It works actually through steps of error and correction. So as an entrepreneur, I think most entrepreneurs have to have, and realize they have to have, pretty thick skins. They may have some weak points, anger, shame. And they do, even if those are not dominant. I hear about them as a therapist. And, I had a client whose weak point was boundaries. It's pretty common, right? Boundaries, setting your boundary. But it's very sticky or tricky because to learn to manage your boundaries better means you have to exercise the boundaries, meaning you have to learn to discern and discriminate and respond and adapt. And so I, with this client, started puncturing her boundaries. And so she fired me. Well, as whatever one does with therapists, that's, I don't want to see you anymore. And so that's very interesting because what she really should have done was engaged the violation of boundaries and prevailed rather than fled. So, I would say the same to you in a kind of metaphorical way. If you're concerned with shame, you should engage shame in ways that are empowering. So, at your next business meeting, come out naked. Well, now that would be ridiculous, but in your mind, you could think that you were naked. You could think that you were exposing yourself, and you probably would, in fact, because it would resonate with that feeling of vulnerability, and that would be good. You want to connect with your weakness in order to find ways to strengthen it, as opposed to trying to be perfect, which is very dangerous because, as I say, to be perfect means the world would have to repeat itself exactly, and your performance would have to repeat itself exactly. And that's not the way the world works. And there are no opportunities, really, unless you are a machine, which keeps punching out the same product every time. But I dislike that notion of being a human.
Thank you. Tell us about some ways to manage anger, aside from what you just said. You basically said to look at, to be more aware of what you're doing, to speak with a therapist. Is there anything else that entrepreneurs can leverage in order to reduce anger? Or would you say that just knowing that it's okay to make mistakes is simply gonna reduce the possible anger, because now the expectation of someone making mistakes, let's say from your team, is kind of like part of the expectation. So therefore you automatically reduce anger by simply knowing that. Is there any other strategy that could work to manage anger before it grows bigger? And the reason I ask you this is because I've noticed anger can have dramatic consequences in terms of your health. Like, it has impacted my throat. I had migraine for 10 years, and luckily I managed to heal the migraine. And I'm still healing my throat, but I do notice the massive impact of anger and negative emotions on my health.
One of the things I tell my insane clients, or the clients who say they're insane, is that I don't really care about your insanity. I'm more concerned with your ability. And I would tend to think of your insanity as an unusual sensitivity, or perhaps an unbalanced power. And I want to know what you can do with it, how you can see it as something useful. And what I'll say to my well-adjusted clients is that you're not so well-adjusted. You're just, you've built a trough through which you flow, and it's somewhat vulnerable to changes. And you are perhaps oblivious to opportunities as well as paths that evolve, so that your weaknesses, which you are overlooking because you think of yourself as powerful and capable, are actually slowly limiting possibilities. So my answer to your question is to relate this story about one of my schizophrenic clients whose problem was anger. And his problem was that he would feel threatened, and then he would find himself handcuffed to some bars in a prison or in a jail. And I had to explore with him, well, what was the anger you felt? What did you do? Who was it? What was the response? And it became clear that he was being triggered by other people's unfriendly behavior. And he was, you could say, well, may not be true, but you could say that it was triggering some sort of childhood feeling of threat. But of course, he was sort of schizophrenic, so it's all a little imbalanced. And his reaction was to get up in their face and threaten them, and to threaten them to back down or push them away. And because he was like 6'4" and a heavy guy, and he had, if you've never seen people with mental disabilities, their facial expressions are kind of flat often. And his, you get a big guy being aggressive with what you think of as a frown, and it's very frightening. And so people would get frightened and they'd call the police and he'd get arrested. And of course, this would happen all the time with all sorts of people. His parents, strangers. And so I said to him, look, you're kind of misinterpreting the situation. And I appreciate that you feel threatened, or in fact, there may be a real threat, but you're not going to manage it by being the adversary. In fact, you're being led or misled into being an adversary. Somebody sees you adversarially and they confront you, and then you amplify it and feel attacked, and it becomes a whole sort of snowball effect. So I said to him, if you can realize that this is going on, if you can step back and realize that there's this whole sort of series of projections and assumptions and misunderstandings, then you can step out of it and work with it and say to somebody, I see you're upset, how can I help you? Instead of, get the hell out of my face or I'll smash your face in, which is what he would do. And so the anger is your projection of their projection or misprojection. Like I say, anger can be useful if it's motivating, directed, and amplifying of something that other people don't see. But if it's a illusion, then you'd be better off recognizing it as such and trying to get alliance, some sort of affirmed, constructive approach to the problem. Recognize, what is the problem? You might say, do you mean to be so aggressive to me? Are you threatening me? I feel you're threatening me. Is that what you mean? And if it is what they mean, well, then you can say, well, that's not going to work with me, or I don't have time for that. Then at least it's called out, and you're not sort of calling them to amplify them, to make them be more of an ass or act like more of an ass yourself. So you want to undo that. I mean, it's like an argument with, if you have kids, your kids. Like, are you serious? You're going to have an argument with a kid as an adult? What are you, an idiot? You don't argue with kids. They're on a completely different wavelength. You find out what their issue is. You have to do that. Well, the truth is that most people still are kids, or at least they're operating from their childhood lessons, childhood trauma, right? Being left outside naked by their grandmother. Everybody has these things, and most people don't remember them, or they don't really recognize them operating. So that's the answer to the anger thing, at least one of them, is to reflect and redirect. Well, the word we often use is reframe. Reframe it as something else. Get back to the issue. What are you trying to solve? What is the object? And is it an object you both share? A goal you both share? Is it a perception you both share? I mean, I was watching a Netflix movie on gunslingers in the West. That probably the paradigm of bad communication. Shooting each other has got to be the worst expression of misplaced anger. So I actually want my son to see that because, like you're saying, if you're really oblivious to how you're handling anger, you can become a real idiot and really manage it poorly. But there are other ways to use anger, which are not internally destructive. Well, it's, what's the word? Transmuted. You transmute it into, something meaningful. So, for example, I'm not a black person. I'm a entitled white guy, and but I grew up in the U.S. and for some reason I was aware of black racism and still am. And if I was black, I think I'd be dead by now. I get so angry by it and so reactive to it that I'd go out and commit some act of violence. And I can't even imagine how black people put up with it. But then I'm not black and I don't have that community and that's not my reality. So in a sense, it's a strange anger, an anger which I don't deserve to have, but and I listen to my black friends tell me these stories, and it's like crazy the way people can act at someone they think badly of. My good friend is Neil Tyson, and he is famous now as a science person, and he says he used to get held up every time he'd leave department stores because, as he later learned, women who were shoplifting would wait for him to go out the door, and then they'd follow him out, and they would trigger the alarm, and the security person would always stop the black guy, which was him. And he thought that was funny after a while. But anyway, it could have been anger. So what do you think? How are you going to deal with your anger?
I don't know. That's why I'm asking you.
Oh, well, okay. Well, reframe it. That's how.
I'm going to add something else to the equation, which is how can I heal my anger, shame, and low self-esteem, knowing that I still feel the world is scary and I want to impact 100 million people to be happier, to go after what they want, to share their stories in books that transform the world and create wealth?
Well, if that's what's meaningful to you and that's what gives you purpose, then that's what you should do. You may find at some point it's not enough or you're not doing it right. Or if you're really self-destructive, you may feel that no matter how much you do, it's never enough or you're not good enough. And those are kind of neurotic attitudes, I would say. And you would be best to recognize that if you're not allowing yourself the chance to fail, you're not really taking advantage of opportunities either. So a certain amount of failure is required if you're going to be exploring new territory. And I mean, that may be a hard lesson for a person who's been taught to perform perfectly, but it's an important one. There's the question of, do you want to be a creative inventor, or do you want to be the provider of perfect commodities? You could say that both have their role. If you want to create lots of books that make millions of people happy, it sounds like you're producing a commodity that's going to do something reliably to a large group of customers. That probably works contrary to being creative and exploring other people's boundaries and pushing what's allowed. So either you can, be a creative rebel on Monday and a reliable producer of a commodity on Tuesday and somehow reconcile the two, or sort of be in the middle. And that's sort of up to you, but I would think that if you can't do them at the same time as the same person, then you'll have to do them as two different people. You'll have to find an environment that allows you to be yourself and indulge the other environment where you get your needs met for being recognized and appreciated. But usually celebrity is not, if you listen to celebrities, the official celebrities like movie stars, they're not very happy people. And I think that's to be expected. Celebrity does not cure low self-esteem or shame, as you probably know.
Thank you. Tell us where entrepreneurs can find you.
Oh, well, I write a lot of books and I do a lot of things, and I have a website at Mind Strength Balance with no spaces, mindstrengthbalance.com. And there's a free blog. If you sign up when you go to that website, a little pop-up comes and asks you for your subscription. Then you get onto the blog, which I publish weekly actually that's got a paywall, monthly for free, weekly for, paywall. So yeah, you can sign up for the free blog. That would be the easiest thing. And then, of course, the website is very deep. It's got hundreds of pages.
Thank you. Follow me for more interviews with world's most innovative health changemakers to live your healthiest life ever.